No, you don't need the.
I'm doing this my way.
He a legend, he a legend, he a legend. He a legend, he a legend, he a legend. He a legend. Welcome to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league of Iron. Welcome to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league, to the league of Iron.
What's up, everybody? It's Pikel with League of Items, and in today's video we are going to take a look at the LEC. I think after doing some preliminary research on some of the new players and the new player combinations on these teams, I think that the league is kind of taking a step backwards in terms of international competitiveness. I think a lot of the players do have, name recognition, and we see some new familiar names in new places. But I don't think that this really increases the upside of the league as a whole. I think we've gotten into a spot where most of the players are known quantities on the international stage, and that's really going to limit the upside of the region. Obviously, results can go your way. Like if one of these rosters with a bunch of well-known names gets into the World Championship and then makes it past the group stage, is it possible for them to win one series or two series? Sure. But does that make them realistic, title contenders? Personally, I don't think so. But we're going to go through the different teams and the different players, and then I'm going to take that information and put that into the tier list that I have. So I'll be revealing the tier list that I have. So first, let's just go through the teams in alphabetical order, and we'll talk about the different players. For these rankings, I will be talking about it from the global perspective. So I have it as the S tier should be thought of as world's contenders, like teams who have a realistic chance of winning a world championship. And that also translates to the players. So I think if you have this player on your team and they're in the S tier, you should think of them as someone who can be on a title contending team. That's basically it. I know that some people will disagree with my definition of title contending at the international level, but this is how I look at it, so that's why you're watching this video. In the A tier, we have players and teams that can be competitive internationally, meaning, make it a couple, have a good group stage performance, be the winning difference for their team in different spots, and, provide something a little unique for their team, and also, make it into the knockout round, and be truly competitive. Make the draft very important. Keep the games relatively close, and maybe pull off an upset. But in those situations, these teams would be the underdog for sure. Then we have the B tier players and teams. Those are domestic winners and international qualifiers. And the reason why there are more players and teams in this tier list than a lot of the other tier lists and a lot of the other tiers is because you can kind of fluke your way into a domestic championship, and you can qualify for worlds without really belonging there in the West. So that's my definition of this. So if a team can make it to the finals in the LEC, I feel like they kind of belong in the B tier, and I think there are a lot of teams that will be competitive in the LEC domestically, but will not be competitive internationally. In the C tier, we have players and teams that are competitive domestically, not necessarily internationally. So what happens in this tier is some players and teams look like, they played a really good match against G2. So if they got to Worlds, maybe they could have a really good run and do something. But from my perspective, just because they play well against G2 doesn't mean that it unlocks some kind of other potential, because at the end of the day, you can only go so far based on your talent and your game plan, and things like that. Then we have the mid-level domestic tier, which is the D tier. You don't want to be in this tier, and you definitely don't want to be in the F tier, which is the no future tier. This is basically if you have players who are way too old and not good enough. So if you're not good enough, obviously you don't want to have them on your team. But if you're not good enough and older, there's really no reason to have that type of player on your team. You might as well take a shot on like some young talent, in my opinion. So let's talk about our first team. So the first team that we will be looking at from a player perspective is Astralis. So I think that Finn, I was very critical of CLG when they paid like $3 million for Finn, and he really didn't do anything in the LCS, but he's still a league average top laner. 1-1-3 in the jungle. He is a new face to the LEC, but he's really not a new face to the League of Legends scene in general. Like, he is younger. He's 18 years old. He was on a team that did pretty well at European Masters, but I don't think that he's really a huge difference maker in the LEC. I think that his champion pool is right in line with, his champion pool makes me think that he's a player that just follows what everybody else is doing, which is fine, but you're not going to be a difference maker in that situation. Or at least you're not going to have control over the game for the most part. Control over drafts, control over the game. Next up, we have Dajor. I think that Dajor is not a very good player, and he limits the upside of his team. So he's one of the first players that I think is a little bit below league average. Like, his team could be competitive domestically, but, it would require something new from this player. Like, he would have to show something new throughout the year for them to really be competitive. Kabe, I think that Kabe is a pretty mediocre AD carry internationally, but he's still good enough at playing hyper carries and like doing his job. Like, if you're going to play a low variance style League of Legends where you're not contesting every objective, but you get to the 20, 25, 30 minute mark and the game is relatively close, he can do what he's supposed to do in those team fights. And then we have Jonghoon, and I think that Jonghoon is a very interesting player. He has very good playmaking upside. He's still relatively young in his professional career, and I have high hopes for Jonghoon, and he's one of the reasons I have some hope for this roster of Astralis. On Excel, we have Odoamne, Xerxes, Vetio, Patrick, and Targamas. Vetio, Patrick, and Targamas, I think all, can be the reason why their team qualifies for an international tournament. Odoamne, I think he is good, but not great at this point in his career. I think that there are a lot of better top laners internationally, but he is good enough, for the LEC level, and that's fine. Xerxes, we haven't seen him be very good the past couple of years, but I always have like a high opinion of Xerxes, and he might actually be the right type of fit for this team. So while he does potentially limit the upside of his team internationally, I think that, he could just be a good fit for this team. On Fnatic, we have Wunder, Razork, Humanoid, Reckless, and Rux. I think that Rux doesn't really belong in the LEC, and it's not because I think that, he will lose every single game for Fnatic. I just don't believe in his upside. I think that we know what Rux is at this point, and it's not, like a player that's going to be competitive internationally. And for a team and an organization like Fnatic, you should have aspirations of, qualifying for Worlds and then trying to make something happen at Worlds, and you don't have that with Rux. I guess one other notable thing here is that I really don't think that Razork and Humanoid are much better than, they're not good enough on the international stage to be the winning difference. And I think that we saw that last year. I know that Upset isn't on the team, and Upset is the one that left, but Upset is a better AD carry than Reckless. So this team is taking a step backwards in my mind, and unless it's like the perfect meta for Humanoid, I kind of look at him as a liability a lot of the time. And, I know that's a very unpopular opinion, but that's why I'm always lower on teams with Humanoid than other people are. G2, we have Broken Blade, Yike, Caps, Hans Sama, and Mickey. I think that Broken Blade could arguably be the best top laner in the league, but I don't think he's good enough to really justify being in a different tier than the rest of the league. Yike is a pretty good player coming into the LEC for the first time. He has played on a couple of teams that did decently well in the European Masters. He is a little bit older. I think he's like 21, so not making your LEC debut until you're 21 isn't really great. But he plays the type of champions that, I want my junglers to play. So I do have some hopes that he could be, solid this year. And I think that G2 will go as far as Yike allows them to go, because he could be a limiting factor. When you have somebody like Caps on your roster, you have a player who I think has world championship upside. He is like insanely experienced and still very good mechanically. And you saw at the World Championship and at MSI how his ability to play a bunch of different champions can kind of warp a draft. Then we have Hansama and Mickey. I think that Hansama obviously had a down year last year, but this kind of team setup makes sense to me. I think that Hansama could be a low resources AD carry, just play the utility style AD carries, give Yike some additional resources because he does play some carry champions like Bel'Veth. So it might just be the right kind of fit for a roster. I think from a roster construction perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Next up, we have Mad Lions, Chasey, Elyoya, Niski, Carzzy, and Hylissang. I don't like Niski. I think that Niski is not a very good mid laner for the professional level. He could be on a team that makes a deep run in playoffs. He could even be on a team that wins a championship domestically, but he will never be the winning difference at a world championship. He will continuously limit his teams at international competition. And it's because of champion pool and the style of play that he has, and also his mechanical ability. He's a lesser version of Humanoid, and I think that Humanoid is a lesser version of Showmaker. So, like, if a person/player like Showmaker exists, you're kind of screwed if you're Humanoid or Niski, because you'll never be the best version of that type of player. And that's kind of that. I know I might get hate for that, but that's just how I kind of look at things. Chasey is, I think, 21 years old, has played on a couple of different European Masters teams. I think it was X7, and they had some good performances, but I don't think that they're really going to be, super competitive on the international stage, like true international. I know some people might say, oh, well, European is international. It's not in like the League of Legends context. Like you really want to be talking about MSI or Worlds. Elyoya is a very good carry jungler, but I don't think that he is the best carry jungler in the region anymore, which is a problem. And then you have Carzzy. Carzzy had a down year, but I think anybody, who is saying his career is over or he's like bad or a liability at this point, I don't think that's really true. I just think that Vitality played some weird drafts last year where they were actually drafting around Carzzy, and they were like continuously picking the Aphelios into the Jinx matchup, and just a bunch of weird stuff like that. And Carzzy, in one of the interviews, gave the opinion that the Aphelios side was the better side to the Jinx matchup, and like every single statistic out there disagrees with that. So that's that. And then Hylissang, I think Hylissang is still a big difference maker, really strong playmaker. I think that him and Elyoya, the combination will be good. Next up we have Koi. So Koi is replacing Rogue in the league. Shigenda is replacing Odoamne for Rogue, and we have the same roster, so they're obviously a very strong roster overall. The question is, can Shigenda play to the level that Odoamne did last year? Odoamne had a pretty good year last year. Malrong had a good year, but unfortunately I think Malrong is a type of jungler who is not really able to carry consistently. He has that gank heavy style, and his champion pool I think limits his upside eventually, and it makes sense why he was like on the Damwon roster, because he was a very different type of jungler to Canyon, but there's a reason why Canyon and the elite carry junglers just look so much more dangerous on the international stage. It's because they have more options to win the game. Then we have Larson. Larson's still one of the best mid laners in the league. Comp had a good year last year, but I want to see it again before I start thinking of him as like, somebody who can be competitive on the international stage. But then we have Trimby, and I think Trimby was definitely the best performer on the team from last year. And there is a world where like he is a world caliber player. I like playmaking supports much better. I don't care if you go 0-6 in a loss. I want you to be able to win your team the game. That's the only thing that I really care about. So let's keep moving. SK Gaming. So we have Irrelevant, Gilius, Certus, Exekick, and DOS. I think both Irrelevant and DOS have kind of shown us that they are not good enough for the LEC, and they will be limiting factors on their team. So when you have that paired with Gilius, who is over the hill, Gilius will put together a good performance every once in a while, and I think he has a good mentality to have on a team, but he's probably better off transitioning into coaching or something like that. If he's going to stay in the scene. I think that SK Gaming is not going to be competitive this split at all. So that's that. Team BDS, they're bringing over their roster from the LFL for the most part. So Adam is coming back to the LEC stage. Adam is good enough to play in the LEC. He's another player who, will look bad in a loss, but that's kind of what you're supposed to do in my mind. Like, if you're not taking risk and, looking like a fool, you probably weren't trying hard enough to like turn the game around. Then we have Shio. I don't believe in Shio. Nuclear Int hasn't really shown us anything impressive for the past couple of years. Crowny, I think that Crowny has been overrated for the past like 2.5, 3 years. And, at best is a mid-level domestic 80 carry. So I don't want a player like Crownshot on my team. He's 24 now as well. And there are 24-year-old players out there who are good enough to win a world championship. It's just Crowny is not one of them. Then we have Labrov. Labrov is good, but not great. And I think that we do have some very good, if not great, supports in the LEC. So that's important to make that distinction. Then we have Heretics, Eevee, Yonkos, Ruby, Jack Spectra, and Mursa. I think that some people will like this team for some reason. But Eevee, even though you can see him like at the world stage, is because his region is so bad in general that he can consistently go to worlds and he has a ton of experience. I think that that's nice, and maybe this is some kind of brand play, but I just don't see him being the winning difference. So yes, while there's no reason to think he's anything worse than an international qualifier, I just don't think he's going to be the winning difference. And it looks like this team doesn't have many players that will be able to create that winning difference domestically, which is a problem because then Eevee's not going to be making it to Worlds this year. We have Yonkos. I think that Yonkos is still a good player, but he is not a great player, and he is not the best player in his position in the region anymore. And he probably hasn't been for about a year and a half. So Yonkos, I love Yonkos, the player. Great career, but he's not the winning difference anymore. Then we have Ruby. Ruby is an older Korean player. I think he's like 24. So even though he's new to the LEC, he's not a new player to the scene. He's played on different like Korean and Chinese teams in the past, I think. And I don't have any reason to think he's going to have upside in the LEC. Then we have Jack Spectra making his first LEC appearance, I think. Not a player that I'm excited about. And we have Mursa. So it's a pretty average team at best. I don't have high expectations for Heretics. And then we have Vitality. We have Photon, Bo, Perks, Neon, and Kaiser. I think we've seen good things from all these players before, except for Photon. I'm not very familiar with Photon. He's only played at the like challenger level in Korea, I think. And that is not great in my mind. I took a look at some of his like match history and stuff like that. Not very impressive in my mind, so it's kind of a little surprising. I had higher hopes before I looked at the match history, but you have Bo. I think that Bo has the upside of being a very, very good jungler. The short amount of time that we saw him on the professional stage before he got banned for match fixing, he was very good for FPX. So I think as an elite carry jungler, he may actually have, world championship upside, which is exciting to get onto a roster in the LEC from an international player. Then we have Perks. Perks has not been as good the past year and a half, but every once in a while you'll get that amazing performance from him. Still very mechanically strong, and I believe in a player like Perks. And if Perks is willing to take on the role of being the second to Bo on this roster, and maybe even the third to Neon, I think we could see something very solid out of Vitality this year. Then we have Neon and Kaiser in the bot lane. Two pretty good players with good careers, so there's no reason to think that they will be horrible this year. So let's go to the rest of the tier portion of this. So in the F tier, we have SK Gaming. And that's because SK Gaming has a bad roster. Irrelevant, DOS, and Gilius are three of the, either worst players or players with the least upside in the region. So is it possible for them to qualify for playoffs? Yes. Do I think it's likely? No. We will most likely see SK Gaming as the worst team in the region. Now in the D tier, we have 2 more teams, and this one is kind of tough for me, but I think that, the reason I have it like this as mid-level is because I don't see the upside cases for these 2 teams. So I think with BDS, I think Atom, Shio, Nuclear Int, Crowny, Labrov, I think that Atom, maybe Nuclear Int, and maybe Labrov can play to the league average, but I think Shio will ultimately be their downfall, and people's expectations are so high for Crown Shot that I think that's going to hurt them as well. So BDS is a team that I will actively be betting against throughout the year. Heretics is probably the best anti-betting spot in the LEC. There's one other team that might be better, but I think with Heretics you have a bunch of names that people recognize. So people know who Eevee is, they know who Yonkos is. People who pay attention globally will know who Ruby is. People who are big fans of Europe may watch European Masters and see Jack Spectra's name and be excited by that. And then we have MRSA. I just don't think that the combination of this team has good enough upside. I don't think that they can really compete with other teams in the region that we will get to later on. So that's probably a little surprising to some people out there. I just don't see, even if they qualify for playoffs, I will never be afraid of this roster unless Yonkos is playing like he did 3 years ago, which is very unlikely in my mind. And I just don't have high hopes for Jack Spectra, and I think I don't really care that Ruby's an international mid laner. We haven't seen anything very impressive from him, basically ever. So let's move up again, and this may also be surprising for some people. We have Mad Lions, Fnatic, and Astralis. I don't have high hopes for Fnatic this year, but let's talk about Astralis first. So I think a lot of people are not looking at this team the right way. I think that Finn is definitely a good enough top laner for the LEC and can be on a team that wins the region. I think that 113 has a little bit of upside. He is only 18 years old. I don't love his champion pool, but if you believe in the upside of Finn, Dajor, and Kabi, I could see why you want somebody like 113 on your team, and maybe he has the ability to play carry champions, but didn't choose to do that very often at a tournament like the European Masters, which is more of a knock against his previous coaching than anything else. Then we have Kabe, who I think is a good enough player to be competitive in the playoffs and maybe qualify for a world championship. But then we have Jonghoon, and I think Jonghoon is really the player that I have the biggest difference of opinion on, and that's why I believe in this team more than a team like Heretics, BDS, or SK Gaming. I think that Jonghoon's playmaking upside can kind of warp a game, and that's really my hope for this team, is that Jonghoon is given the ability to kind of be the most important player on the team. You don't see that very often with support players, but if they do it that way, I think Astralis can surprise some people. Next up, we have Fnatic. And I think the problem with Fnatic's roster is that it's too bland. I think that Wonder is on the wrong side of his career. I think that Razork is getting a little overrated at this point. He is consistent, but he can still get blown out of the water by true carry junglers, which is a big problem. He's a somewhat one-dimensional jungler in my mind. Where yes, you can play League of Legends that way. It's not exciting, and it will never do well on the international stage. So why do it? If you think that winning a domestic championship is this great accomplishment, then fine. I see why you would want to build a roster like that, but it really does limit your international upside. And I think that teams should really care more about Worlds than they do about their own region. But you have to win your region to get to Worlds. But some players don't have that different gear to move up into that next level. And I think that's the problem with Razork. Humanoid, I think Humanoid's one of the most overrated players in the world. Again, having a player like Humanoid on your team will make it more likely to win your domestic league, because his playstyle is difficult to play against for lesser players. But that playstyle on the international stage just isn't good enough. He's just not good enough on the international stage. So I basically need to have a lower opinion of Fnatic than everybody else, because they will consistently be favorites in spots where I don't think they should be the favorite, and I will consistently bet against them next year. Then we have Reckless coming back to the LEC. People want Reckless to do well. I'm not convinced that that's going to happen. If he does, great, but I doubt it. And then we have Rux, and I think that Rux is not good enough. I don't know why you would sign a 26-year-old support at this point when you have other options in the LEC. And maybe they didn't have any other options, but still, I don't see why a team like Fnatic, who should have aspirations of making it to the World Championship, would sign a player like Rux. Then we have Mad Lions. I think that Mad Lions with Chasey, some people might be excited because he's a Korean top laner. I don't think that he's going to have that huge upside. He does have some pop-off performances, but I don't think he's going to be the consistent player they need. Because you need someone consistent when you have Nisqy on your team. Nisqy is not consistent. Nisqy is not an elite player, and ultimately is a liability against a lot of the other mid laners in the LEC. Then we have Elyoya. I think that Elyoya is the second best, or probably the second best jungler in the LEC right now. And the reason I say that is because he's a carry style jungler, where that's the style that I prefer. And I think that shows that he has additional upside as long as his team is playing at an okay level, not 6 or 7 times out of 10, his team will get a benefit from having Elyoya on the team. Then we have Carzzy and Hylissang. Carzzy, I did not like his performance last year. I thought that he was kind of one of the reasons why Vitality didn't do better. But I also blame the coaches for that, because their coaching staff was horrible. And then we have Hylissang, and I think that Hylissang, again, he dies in spectacular ways. That bothers some people. It doesn't bother me at all. I still think that he is good enough to compete on the international stage. Let's move into the B tier. And we have 2 more teams. So let's do this. So we have 2 more teams, and I guess that makes it obvious what the last 2 teams are. But let's just talk about all 4 of them, I guess, at this point. So we have XL and Koi in the B tier, and we have Vitality and G2 in the A tier. So let's talk about Koi first. Shigenda, I do think that Shigenda is a limiting player on this team. Odoamne is better than Shigenda, so they are taking a step backwards. It's possible that Shigenda has developed slightly since their last shot with a good team. So the hope would be that he can be better than Odoamne this year. I'm somewhat skeptical, so I do think that he is, competitive domestically at best. But in the better case scenarios, because you have such a solid team around him, if he does have more carry upside than Odoamne, that could be, a good fit for Koi. So Malrong, I do think that Malrong is probably the best early game jungler in the LEC, and that does create a lot of advantages for the team. So just from a tactical perspective, they're a strong roster. Larson, still one of the better mid laners in the region, didn't have a great world championship, but still a good player overall. And then we have Comp and Trimby. I think that Trimby does have elite upside. He may actually be a world caliber support, and I know there are a lot of people who watch this channel that agree and have kind of been pushing that narrative for all of last year. So I think that Koi, just because of the general talent level of these players and the upside of players like Larson and Trimby, I think that you have to kind of put them into the B tier at worst, which is they would be domestic winners and international qualifiers. I do not think that this roster has the upside of winning a world championship or being very competitive, being truly competitive in the knockout round of a world championship, unless Shigenda plays out of his mind, which I guess is possible, but unlikely. Next up, we have XL, and I'm pretty excited by this XL roster. I think that Odoamne is a good but not great player. Xerxes is really going to be the player that makes this team or breaks this team. Vetio, Patrick, and Targamas are all obviously good enough. I think that it's funny watching G2 last year and seeing Targamas play. Everybody was like, "Oh, Flockid's really good. Flockid's a good player. Why isn't he on a team?" and stuff like that. Flockid was getting carried by Targamas for most of the year, and I think that Targamas has that playmaking upside, which you really want from a young support. So, similar to Jonghoon and Trimby, I think they're the 3 supports that will be taking over for Mickey, Hylissang, Kaiser for the next year or two. I love their playmaking upside, which is something that's very important to have in a support. And then obviously Vetio. I think Vetio is probably a top 5 to 10 player in the region. Same thing with Patrick. So when you have two of the better players in the region, you should be very competitive. I think that if Xerxes is a liability in spring and they get a new jungler, they could be competitive internationally. I'm not sure what it would take to make this team like a true Worlds contender. You'd probably need a different top laner and jungle. And then let's go to G2. So G2 is a team that I had to push against last year all year long because I didn't think that they were as good as everybody else did. And part of that was because, I just didn't think they were that good. Like, Caps was kind of carrying consistently, which is a pretty surprising thing. The reason why they're so successful is because they have a good coaching staff and can draft consistently, have good game plans. So, we shouldn't be giving the players as much credit. So roster turnover isn't as scary when you have that kind of situation. Broken Blade had a good year. Yike. Is he good enough to be an LEC jungler? I think probably, but we need to see that for sure. His champion pool is interesting. He does lean towards being a carry player, which is something I want, especially with Caps, where Caps has all of this experience on the international stage, but he will eventually decline mechanically. We didn't really see that for the most part last year, but that's coming. And then Hansama and Mickey are two more good players where if Yike does have that true carry upside, this kind of roster will be very good. Like Broken Blade and Yike can try to carry the games, be more aggressive and volatile. Caps can just go even in the mid lane, help shot call, and get to those like pivotal fights during the mid game, and try to make something happen for his team. Like that's a pretty good way to construct a roster, I think. Then last but not least, we have Vitality, and I'm excited about Vitality again. Unfortunately, last year it didn't work out for them. I was also hopeful for Vitality last year, but it just didn't work out. They weren't consistent enough. So I think Photon, I don't have as much hope in Photon as I did before doing the research, but Bo should be the best player. If not, Bo should be the first or second best player in the region this split. He is very volatile, so it may not look that way in terms of having a good performance and a bad performance and a good performance and a bad performance just because of draft and the types of champions that he plays. But when it all averages out by the end of the year, I think that we'll see that Bo is probably the best jungler in the region, one of the best players, if not the best player in the region, even though he is a match fixer. And then we have Perks. Perks is still one of the better mid laners. I believe in long-term talent, so until it's completely gone, we know that he has that upside in him. And then we have Neon and Kaiser. Neon had a good year last year. It'll be interesting to see if he can repeat that performance, and I think that if we have Bo playing at a high level, Perks being flexible and playing at a high level, then Photon can go even, Neon and Kaiser can go even, and that'll be a pretty good recipe for success in the LEC. And obviously, with that being said, those are all 10 teams. I do not think that the LEC has a realistic chance of winning Worlds this year. None of their teams seem good enough without additional roster changes. I think that if you put Broken Blade and Bo onto XL, I think that team would maybe have a chance at a world championship, but probably not. So that's basically it. I know there's some controversial stuff in here. I know there's already somebody commenting on this. I was live streaming this on YouTube. They're not happy that I put Fnatic in the C tier. But I think Fnatic will surprise people and not be that good. And if you look at it, Fnatic being in the C tier means they'll end up like 4th, 5th, 6th, like between 3rd and 6th, I think is the most realistic outcome for Fnatic in both splits, which should be in the C tier because they're not going to be truly competitive, I think, to like win tournaments or like win the splits. And if they go out and win a split, that's fine, but you don't have that upside of doing well at Worlds, then why should we rank you any higher? So that's that. Basically, that's it.
Thanks for watching.